On the night of the 29th of November 2013, the Clutha Vaults was exactly what it had always been. Loud, crowded, and alive in that unmistakable Glasgow way, and strangers became friends over pints that never seemed to stay full for long. Inside, the ska band Esperanza were mid-set, their sound filling the room as more than 100 people filled the pub. It was a night people had come out for, drawn in by the music, by the atmosphere, and by that shared experience of standing in a packed room as a live band played just feet away. The kind of night that settles into memory, and not because it is routine, but because it feels alive in the moment, and yet in ways no one present could have known, it would become one of the most defining nights in the city's modern history, because above them, unseen and unnoticed, a police helicopter was tracing its way back across the Glasgow skyline, and within minutes, two completely separate worlds were about to collide in a way no one inside that pub could possibly have imagined. Above the rooftops of Glasgow, a police helicopter moved steadily across the darkened sky, returning from a sequence of tasks that had begun hours earlier with a search for a trespasser on railway lines. The aircraft was a Eurocopter EC-135 operated for Police Scotland, and on board were three people who had done this many times before. Captain David Trail, a highly experienced pilot and former RAF instructor, alongside police officers Kirsty Nellis and Tony Collins. Their shift had been routine, their tasking uneventful, and by the time they began their return leg towards Glasgow City Heliport, there was nothing outwardly remarkable about the flight. And yet inside the cockpit something had already begun to go wrong. The first indication came in the form of a warning that pilots are trained never to ignore. A low fuel alert illuminated on the instrument panel, accompanied by an audio warning designed to cut through the distraction and demand immediate attention. It was not subtle, nor was it ambiguous. It was a direct instruction backed by a procedure that the aircraft should land within 10 minutes. This was a scenario every pilot understood, one drilled repeatedly in training, with clear steps to follow and very little room for interpretation. And yet, the helicopter did not begin an immediate descent. Instead, it remained on its course over the city, continuing across the Glasgow skyline as the time available to respond steadily ran out. What investigators would later uncover was a detail both simple and deeply troubling. The helicopter still carried fuel, enough that it should not have been in immediate danger. But the transfer pumps that moved that fuel into the supply tanks had been switched off, leaving the engines to draw from a limited reserve that was running out. Why those pumps were off has never been conclusively explained, and without cockpit voice recordings or flight data, the final decisions made inside that aircraft remain unknown. On the ground on Stockwell Street along the south bank of the River Clyde stood the Clutha Vaults, a pub whose very name reaches back into the city's past. Clutha, an old name for the Clyde itself, had long been a place where music, drink and community intertwined, a space shaped as much by history as by the people who filled it each night. Once part of a tenement building, its upper floors were lost to fire decades earlier, leaving the pub as a kind of survivor, standing alone where homes had once been, its walls carrying the history of a different Glasgow. That night, outside of the pub, people began to notice something unusual before anyone inside had reason to look up. The sound of the helicopter changed, shifting from the steady, reassuring rhythm of powered flight into something uneven, strained and unfamiliar. One witness would later describe it as like a car stalling, while another spoke of a spluttering noise that seemed to hang in the air, out of place against the normal sounds of the city at night. What they were hearing was the beginning of dual engine failure as the fuel supply to the engines was exhausted one after the other. In theory, this was a scenario pilots trained for, an opportunity to bring the aircraft down using auto-rotation, guiding it safely to the ground without engine power. But the conditions here were far from ideal. It was night over a densely built city with limited visual reference points, and as the second engine failed, electrical systems began to drop away, reducing the pilot's situational awareness at the worst possible moment. In those final seconds, the margin for recovery narrowed rapidly and then disappeared altogether. Inside the Clutha Vaults, the music continued. Esperanza played on. The crowd pressed close, unaware that above them a powerless helicopter was descending towards the building. Then, without warning, something struck the roof above them. At first, it wasn't immediately clear what had happened. A section of the ceiling gave way, with debris falling into the bar and interrupting the performance, the noise cutting sharply through the music. For a moment there was confusion rather than panic, as people looked upwards, trying to understand what they were seeing. But within seconds the situation escalated. Larger sections of the roof began to fail, and then the full weight of the aircraft came down into the structure, bringing timber, masonry and metal crashing into the crowded room below. The force of the impact drove debris across the bar, pinning some where they stood, trapping others beneath collapsed beams and broken roofing, while a few, by chance alone, found themselves in spaces that had not yet given way, managing to escape with seconds to spare. Survivors would later describe the sound as overwhelming, a tearing, grinding crash, followed by the sudden absence of music. And then the noise of falling debris, breaking glass, and people shouting over one another in the dark. The air filled with dust, thick enough to choke and sting the eyes, carrying the smell of plaster, wood and fuel, as visibility dropped and the room was reduced to shadows and shapes. Then came the voices, people calling out, searching for friends, trying to reach those pinned beneath the wreckage, as confusion gave way to urgency and the scale of disaster inside the pub became clear. Many believed in those first moments there had been an explosion. Others spoke of a brief, stunned pause where everything seemed suspended, before the reality of what just occurred began to take hold. Outside, the response began almost immediately, not just from emergency services, but from the people who had been nearby when it happened. Those who had been standing outside or in neighbouring streets ran towards the pub. At first there was disbelief. One witness would later say it looked like the roof had just folded in on itself, the shape of the helicopter barely visible through the collapsed structure. But very quickly disbelief gave way to action. People began pulling at debris with their hands, shouting into the darkness and listening for voices in return. Some formed makeshift lines passing pieces of wood and rubble back out onto the street, working together without being asked. Others helped the injured as they emerged, guiding them away from the building, some covered in dust, some bleeding, many in shock. One man later recalled, "You could hear people shouting from inside. You just knew you had to get in there." When emergency services arrived, they were met with a scene that was both crowded and fragile, the remains of the building unstable, with sections of roof and debris still at risk of shifting. Firefighters and paramedics had to balance urgency with caution, moving carefully into the structure, knowing that every action carried risk, not just for those trapped inside, but for the crews themselves. The rescue that followed was slow, controlled and painstaking. Crews worked methodically, removing debris piece by piece, often by hand, listening for any sign of life beneath the wreckage. The air remained thick with dust, the smell of fuel lingering, floodlights illuminating a scene that had become quieter, but no less intense as the night wore on. Hours turned into a full night, and then into the following day as the operation shifted from rescue to recovery. It would take 2 days before every part of the site had been searched. By then, the scale of the tragedy was clear. 10 people had lost their lives. Captain David Trail, age 51, an experienced pilot and former RAF instructor, had spent years training others to fly safely, his career defined by discipline and precision. Police Constable Kirsty Nellis, 36, was known as a dedicated officer and a mother, someone deeply committed both to her work and her family. Police Constable Tony Collins, 43, had served with quiet professionalism, respected by colleagues who knew him as dependable and steady under pressure. Inside the pub were 7 more people, each there for a night of music that would never end the way they expected. Robert Jenkins, 61, a grandfather remembered as warm and sociable, someone who enjoyed the simple routines of life. Mark O'Prey, 44, described by those who knew him as someone who loved life and lived it to the full. Colin Gibson, 33, the youngest among them, known for his close friendships and easygoing nature. John McGarrigle, 57, a regular in the Clutha, part of the fabric of the place itself. Gary Arthur, 48, a much-loved friend and father whose loss was felt deeply by those around him. Samuel McGee, 56, remembered as a sociable man with a wide circle of friends. And Joe Cusker, who had been pulled from the wreckage but would later die in hospital from his injuries. They were not just names in a report, but people rooted in their communities, each with families, friendships, and lives that extended far beyond that night. One partner would later say with devastating simplicity, "I went in with him and came out alone." In the aftermath, Glasgow responded in a way that spoke to the character of the city itself, not through grand gestures at first, but through immediate, practical acts of support that spread quickly from street to street. Fundraising efforts began almost as soon as the scale of the disaster became clear. Collection buckets appeared on bars across Glasgow and far beyond, with pubs throughout Scotland raising money for the victims and their families. In the days that followed, organised appeals took shape, with thousands of pounds raised through benefit nights, charity events and local initiatives, each one reflecting the same instinct: to do something, however small, to help. Floral tributes built up outside the pub, handwritten messages left alongside them, turning the pavement into a place of remembrance as much as mourning. Businesses also stepped forward. Companies across the city offered support, materials and labour, contributing to the long process of repairing and restoring the Clutha itself. Tennent's, a Scottish brewery company, became involved in supporting both fundraising efforts and the wider recovery, reinforcing the sense that this was not just one venue's loss, but something felt across the entire city. They offered to pay the wages of the bar staff until they could work again. There were quieter acts too, people checking in on survivors, helping families navigate the days that followed, offering time, transport and support without recognition, the kind of responses that rarely make headlines but form the backbone of how communities endure events like this. In the weeks that followed, as the city moved towards Christmas, celebration did not come easily that year. The usual lights and gatherings remained, but the atmosphere felt different, quieter, as reflection and remembrance sat just beneath the surface, and thoughts returned again and again to the Clutha, to those who had been lost there, and to the families. Financially, the cost of the disaster would eventually exceed £10 million, including compensation and legal settlements, but those figures only tell part of the story. Alongside them sits something less measurable: the collective response of a city that refused to let the Clutha stand alone in what had happened, and instead surrounded it in the days and months that followed with a level of support that reflected just how deeply the loss had been felt. From the outset, its owner, Alan Crossan, had been clear that the Clutha would return, not because it could be rebuilt, but because it meant too much to be lost. In the days that followed, that feeling was reflected across the city, as messages of support, fundraising efforts, and offers of help made it clear that the Clutha mattered far beyond its own walls. It eventually reopened its doors on the 24th of July 2015, following months of careful repair and restoration. The occasion was marked not just by those connected to the pub, but at a national level, with Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon in attendance. When the doors opened again, much of it remained recognisable to those who had known it before. The stage was still there, the music returned, and the pub once again filled with people, not in defiance of what had happened, but alongside it. At the same time, it had inevitably changed. Subtle reminders of the disaster remained, and the Clutha took on a new role as a place of remembrance as well as gathering. Memorials to those who lost their lives became part of the space, and anniversaries were marked not just quietly but collectively, as the pub and the city paused to reflect. The official investigation carried out by the Air Accidents Investigation Branch provided some answers but left others unresolved. Its findings confirmed that the helicopter's engines had failed due to fuel starvation, not because the aircraft had run out of fuel entirely, but because fuel was no longer reaching the engines. Although a significant quantity remained in the main tank, the transfer pumps responsible for supplying the smaller feed tanks had been switched off, leaving the engines to draw from a limited reserve until it was exhausted. The report also established that multiple low fuel warnings had been triggered and acknowledged. and that, according to procedure, the aircraft should have landed within 10 minutes of those alerts. Instead, it remained airborne beyond that window, continuing over the city as the situation developed. However, when it came to the most critical question, why those warnings did not lead to an immediate landing, and why the fuel pumps were off in the first place, the investigation was unable to provide a definitive answer. There had been previous concerns raised about aspects of the aircraft's fuel system, including the accuracy and behaviour of its fuel indications, and recommendations had been issued to operators to introduce updated components. These changes, however, were not mandatory and were typically incorporated during scheduled maintenance intervals, meaning not all aircraft had yet been modified. In aviation, this kind of approach is not unusual for issues considered non-critical, but in the case of the Clutha crash, it became part of a wider discussion about whether system designs, warnings, and human factors had all been fully accounted for. The helicopter was not equipped with a cockpit voice recorder or flight data recorder, meaning there was no direct record of the crew's actions or conversations in those final minutes. As a result, key elements of the timeline had to be reconstructed from limited data and inference, leaving the final moments of the flight only partially understood. For investigators, the findings were clear. For families, they were not enough. For the families of those who died, that uncertainty has remained one of the hardest aspects to accept. Some have questioned whether the investigation placed too much emphasis on pilot actions, while others have struggled with the absence of accountability as no criminal charges were ever brought. Over time, the Clutha disaster has come to represent not only a profound tragedy, but also a case study in how, even after detailed investigations, some events resist complete explanation. The story of that night now sits between what is known and what may never be known, grounded in established facts but shaped just as much by absence, by the missing voices, the unanswered questions, and the sense that something essential remains just out of reach. What is certain is the moment itself. A crowded pub, a band mid-song, a room full of people, brought together by music and a helicopter descending through the darkness, changing everything in the space of seconds. What remains uncertain is everything that led to that final descent. And perhaps that is why, more than a decade later, the Clutha is remembered not only for what happened, but for what still cannot be fully explained. Now, this was a very tragic story, and our condolences go out to the families of those who lost their lives, and also our best wishes to those who were injured. Despite the tragedy, I hope you appreciated the way the information was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll wish you bye-bye for now.